Come see us on tour in Dallas, Texas, Baltimore, Atlantic City, Cohoes, New York, and Providence, Rhode Island. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets, and only there.
But I want to jump on what you just said there about Ukraine. That's a good segue into this. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken sat down this week with the New York Times, and he made what, was a stunning admission if you haven't been paying much focus to this, although it's probably not so stunning to you. But let's hear what he had to say.
So first, if you look at the trajectory of the conflict, because we saw it coming, we were able to make sure that not only were we prepared and allies and partners were prepared, but that the Ukraine was prepared. We made sure that well before the Russian aggression happened, starting in September, the Russian aggression happened in February, starting in September and then again in December, we quietly got a lot of weapons to Ukraine to make sure that they had in hand what they needed to defend themselves, things like Stingers, javelins that they could use, that were instrumental in preventing Russia from taking Kyiv, from rolling over the country, erasing it from the map, and indeed pushing the Russians back.
All right, so that is kind of sleazy and deceptive framing of that. Obviously, he talks about arming Ukraine as a defensive move, but I think this raises the question pretty strongly, did we arm Ukraine to protect Ukraine, or was it always just about provoking Russia into a war?
It was always about provoking Russia into a war. And we saw evidence for that early in the century. We had the Budapest Memorandum, we had discussions at NATO conferences, and everything was about pushing NATO further east. And Ukraine and Georgia, so you'll remember Georgia, we wanted to bring that in, and the Georgians armed themselves with our equipment, and they listened to our advice, and of course they were defeated by the Russians, who immediately dispatched forces there to quell that particular threat. If you live in Russia, and you look at the periphery, remember Russia probably has 15, 16 nations that border its territory. And you're talking about thousands of miles of open border. They're rather sensitive to who does what, where in the neighborhood, right, as we are. I mean, if we saw large numbers of Chinese or Russian advisors show up in Mexico and started shipping in weapons and equipment, unlike the Russians, I don't think we would have waited more than 8 years to take action. They actually tried to talk to us. They approached us. They asked us not to do what we were doing. So it wasn't exactly quiet, as Mr. Blinken suggests. And as it turned out, the people who were unprepared to go into Ukraine were the Russians. We've been hearing over and over and over again, well, Russia wants desperately to conquer Eastern Europe, regain its empire, and all this nonsense. Well, if that was the case, what was their problem when they went into Ukraine? Their problem was that they didn't have a very large force. It wasn't so much that it wasn't well trained, it just wasn't very large. It wasn't rich in firepower. They ran into hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian troops, heavily armed with our equipment, and it turned into a real fight. Then even when the Ukrainians stepped forward and said, well, we'd like an end to this, and they met in Istanbul, we intervened through our friend Boris Johnson in London and said, whatever you do, don't stop. We'll give you everything you've ever wanted. You can't lose. You'll have the entire scientific industrial might of Great Britain and the United States behind you. So please go for it. Keep fighting. And so the Ukrainians did. At that point, the Russians said, well, I guess we're going to have to mobilize forces. We're going to have to reopen our industries, reinvigorate our industries, re-examine our stocks. I mean, the difference between the Russian army that exists today and what existed in 2022 in February is profound. The only thing we've succeeded in doing is creating the largest and most powerful Russian military establishment that we've seen since the mid-'80s. And frankly, it's better than the old Soviet military establishment was. Better manned, better officered, better led, with less corruption. So I think he's selling you a bunch of nonsense, but that's not unusual for him.
Well, speaking of nonsense, I mean, the three terms that Russia laid out at the beginning of the war were they wanted independence for those separatist regions, they wanted recognition of the Crimea as theirs, and of course they wanted a neutral Ukraine that would not join NATO. Absent from that list of demands is Kyiv. Like, they didn't even want Ukraine. So the idea that they want all of Europe is just so absurd. It was always so absurd. Their list of demands to avoid the war entirely, I just read them, did not even include Ukraine. So how is it that people came to believe in sufficient enough numbers, I suppose, for a short time? I think now the propaganda is starting to really wear off in a big way, here at home at least. How were people convinced that he was the next Hitler on the march? I mean, it was just so absurd on its face.
Well, you know that Washington is donor-occupied territory. So the first thing you do is listen to your donors. Who are your big donors? And then you listen to, sadly, all the people that sit in these so-called think tanks. Well, the think tanks are also owned by donors. The think tanks advocate for agendas. In fact, we don't call them think tanks anymore. We call them advocacy tanks. And they provide all this so-called background information. So if you're Senator Johnson, I think he was from where, the Midwest, and he comes out as this violent anti-Russian. Why is that? Well, look at the people that he receives contributions from. Some of them are East Europeans. He's got a lot of Poles and Czechs and Germans and others whose ancestors came from that part of the world. And in their minds, Russians are bad. And it's an easy sell because we were in Cold War with the Russians for how many decades? So they're accustomed to being psychologically prepped with all this anti-Russian propaganda. So nobody bothers to look at what was really offered. They just dismiss it out of hand and say, well, the Russians can't be trusted. Why do you say that? Well, everybody else says it. I have a friend who's on the Hill. I won't mention his name, but he stepped forward. He said, I'm not going to vote for this stuff. And somebody said, why not? He said, because it's not true. And the answer he got from his colleagues who are Republicans was, well, everybody else is voting for it. What's wrong with it?
Right.
It's groupthink. And remember, what did it cost any of these people? They don't see it. It's just like, you print another $1 trillion. It doesn't cost them anything. At least they don't think it will. And we know there is a cost. And we're edging ever closer to that financial catastrophe that looms on the horizon. But Eastern Ukraine, hey, if I live in lower Montana, do I really care what happens in Eastern Ukraine? Unfortunately, we don't. And because we don't, we let other people in Washington hijack policy. They take it over, and then they use the armed forces any way they wish.
Come see us on tour in Dallas, Texas, Baltimore, Atlantic City, Cohoes, New York, and Providence, Rhode Island. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets, and only there.